Welcome to episode 4 of 7 Robots.
Fantastically Terrible podcast. Today's discussion is about The Shining. We just watched it again a couple of nights ago, and we were struck by certain currents running through the movie. The Overlook Hotel was an isolated microcosm in which the supernatural was somehow generated by human psychology, similar to Carl Jung's idea of the collective unconscious and the shadow self of both Jung and Freud. But what specific psychology? Well, Jack Torrance. The main character, played by Jack Nicholson, summed it up best when he referenced Kipling's poem, "White man's burden, Lloyd, my man, white man's burden."
We decided to watch The Shining again, as we've done quite a few times, and as always, more meanings slapped us in the face. The most profound moment for me this time was the restroom scene with Delbert Grady, the former caretaker, and Jack. And we'll play a little clip of that later. I was very curious about what Kubrick and his co-writer Diane Johnson had in mind for the film. I found a great Scraps from the Loft interview with Diane Johnson with tons of interesting information. And as always, we provide links to everything we mention, big and small, at www.7robots.com/podcast. Let's start with a few parts of the interview, and then we'll dissect the film a little later to give you our take on what we thought it meant. Okay, so this is quoting from Diane. "My own work with Kubrick in 1979 came about as a result of his reading my novel The Shadow Knows, 1974, a psychological novel with certain connections to the detective story, in my mind, dealing with racial issues and urban violence, or in the minds of some readers, about the deteriorating state of mind of the young woman under stress who is perhaps or perhaps not being stalked."
When it came to the horror film, he did not want to make a movie that depended unduly on ghosts and gimmicks for horror effect. Though he did not rule out the supernatural, he wanted to create a film which the horror generated from human psychology. This was the case with my novel, and also to some extent with Stephen King's novel The Shining from 1977. There are some apparitions in the latter that can be taken for projections of the disturbed mind of the hero Jack Torrance, and are also supernatural. For whatever reason, Kubrick chose to use The Shining. He did, however, choose me to write the script.
For Stephen King, I gather from his remake of The Shining, 1997, the character flaws of the father were of less interest than the supernatural powers of foresight of Danny, the little boy, and the hotel was the villain, evil locked in combat with the good child. It was the character of the father that interested Kubrick. The powers of the boy were mainly metaphorical, a child's heightened sensitivity to the demons rising in the adults who have power over him. To what extent supernatural forces existed, and to what extent these were psychological projections, was something we discussed at length, finally deciding that the ghosts and magical apparitions at the Overlook Hotel were both, that the supernatural was somehow generated by human psychology, but once generated really existed and had power. Could Lloyd, the ghostly caretaker bartender, open the door, for instance, to let Jack out of the freezer, pour him a drink, hand him a baseball bat? The answer had to be yes.
Kubrick would avail himself of these and other traditional ingredients of horror. For instance, the moldering corpse of the woman in the bathtub, which was also in King's text, but it was typical of Kubrick to want an explanation of the nature of horror, wanting to understand the underlying psychological mechanism, but also willing to accept the convention of the supernatural. Thus, he wanted a rational explanation for the haunting of the hotel. He was drawn to the idea that the place rested on the site of Indian massacres, or that building it had desecrated some Native American tombs, with all the ghosts and hauntings summoned thereby. Clearly, he had no objection to the idea of something being haunted, that is, of the supernatural per se. It was just that there had to be a reason for it. He was quite capable of living with the paradox of something being both true and untrue at the same time.
When I read this, it really clicked. That idea of the suppressed feelings, the dark self, the shadow self.
Right.
And when it comes to Danny, and The Shining maybe, and the house even, and Halloran, they're connected more.
Right.
They're connected to whatever the collective unconscious is.
Right. And when Halloran says there's a residue from events, that's what you're seeing. It's not really real. It's like seeing images.
I'll play a clip for that now so they know what you mean.
You know, Doc, when something happens, it can leave a trace of itself behind. Say, like, if someone burns toast. Well, maybe things that happen leave other kind of traces behind. Not things that anyone can notice, but things that people who shine can see. Just like they can see things that haven't happened yet. Well, sometimes they can see things that happened a long time ago. I think a lot of things happened right here in this particular hotel over the years. And not all of them was good.
So if we take those elements from the interview, which I think really lay out what the hotel is, what is causing the haunting, what is causing the evil.
Right.
And very clearly, Kubrick was fine with having that dual nature of something physically happening and also human psychology.
Right.
And that's why that scene first was the restroom scene, and the other was referencing white man's burden.
Yeah, that always put me off until I was much older and I realized it was a Kipling quote.
That's right. It's from a Kipling poem, and the full title is The White Man's Burden, the United States and the Philippine Islands.
Right.
And that was the war, the Philippine-American Wars.
But it was a specific to the United States that they should take up empire. Mm-hmm.
So to take up empire, colonization, the civilizing of other lesser cultures.
Right. Well, what they deemed lesser.
Of course. Not in reality. It all ties into this deluded idea that it is the white man's burden to bring civilization to everyone else.
Right.
Okay, and if we now do one more connection to the restroom scene, and I'll play that now for you.
Did you know, Mr. Torrance, that your son is attempting to bring an outside party into this situation? Did you know that?
No.
He is, Mr. Torrance.
Who?
A nigger.
A nigger?
A nigger cook. Your son has a very great talent. I don't think you are aware how great it is. But he is attempting to use that very talent against your will.
He is a very willful boy.
Indeed he is, Mr. Torrance. A very willful boy. A rather naughty boy, if I may be so bold, sir.
It's his mother. She interferes.
Perhaps they need a good talking to, if you don't mind my saying so. Perhaps a bit more. My girls, they didn't care for the Overlook at first. One of them actually stole a pack of matches and tried to burn it down. But I corrected them, sir. And when my wife tried to prevent me from doing my duty, I corrected her.
We clearly see that the white man's burden, whether it's in the Overlook Hotel, whether it's over your family, whether it's over the Philippine Islands,
Right.
whether it's moving west
Right.
and massacring the Native Americans to take their land because they're
Right.
savages and we need to civilize them.
That's the thinking.
All of it is dominance. And in this restroom scene, what's the answer to everything? If it's against your will, you have to crush them.
Right.
And
there's even a racial, the whole dropping of the N-word.
Oh, yeah,
is
that wasn't by accident.
It wasn't by accident.
Again, they're on a lesser level.
Right.
So you need to correct everyone, children, women, any other
It's hierarchy.
nationality, heritage, color, absolutely. And I love the way he really stressed to be corrected. They had
Yes.
to correct his children
Right.
and then his wife. Even if correction means murder, that is fine.
Yeah.
If you don't follow my will, that is the conclusion.
That is. Yeah, that is the ultimate conclusion.
So I thought all of those together, and that's why I really like that interview, is completely the psychology and the background. The background thinking, the mental psychology that makes the hotel so evil,
Right.
plus the actual historical acts,
Right.
all mixed together
Right.
to make that, as you mentioned earlier, like a microcosm.
Yeah, well, it's a microcosm of the country in many ways. Because you could take a big house, it could be a plantation, and you have a white man in charge.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, the white man in charge. His wife, Wendy, I know there might be there's all
No,
sorts
but
of
she's
crazy
very
theories.
submissive.
She's submissive, but there's something about her that's very pilgrim-like too. You know, the sort of dressing, even for the 80s or 70s, it was something very,
a lot of overall type
very
clothing.
homebody-ish, right?
And the only time she wasn't wearing those types of clothes that looked very cartoonish with the reds and the blues,
I know they tie that to Goofy.
they do. I had a reference where it's this fairy tale element she has, and I think it's part of depicting her denial of what's going on, living in a fairy tale world.
Right.
But you're right; it does look like she's on a farm or something.
Funny that you mentioned the word fairy tale, because that also works in the collective unconscious of young. Many of the fairy tales.
Did I hit the collective unconscious
think
when
you
I
hit
said
it,
that?
yeah.
Oh, well, go on.
You also have Halloran, who's a black cook. Mm-hmm. So when you have a big house, the white man in charge.
Yeah, that's true.
And it sort of starts to place to some very interesting things. But overall, what's also very interesting is a lot of the art in
It's
it is Native
everywhere.
American.
And an indigenous Canadian artist who I noticed a couple of his paintings in there.
Right.
The Great Mother and Flock of Loons. But
Right.
it's not just his. There's tons of Native American art.
Right. And then there's the hotel manager giving the tour of the hotel to the family, telling them about how it's actually built on a Native American Indian burial ground.
That's right. Now play that clip now.
When was the Overlook built?
Construction started in 1907. It's finished in 1909. The site is supposed to be located on an Indian burial ground, and I believe they actually had to repel a few Indian attacks as they were building it.
For me, seeing all that art, it's like any museum. It becomes a trophy.
Yeah.
It's like you hunted these people, and now you're displaying your trophies. What you have later is the scene where he's playing the ball.
Yeah, and
with
he's
the ball.
throwing it at the artwork.
He's throwing it at the artwork, and next to it, there's a buffalo head. What could be more clear that shows this sort of trophy, this prize?
Right.
And he's disrespecting it. He doesn't even care about it.
Right. It doesn't matter if it's people or animals. They just slaughter everything.
Right. And actually, how they defeated the Lakota was by slaughtering the buffalo, the bison.
And there's pictures you can find. Maybe I'll reference one of them on the website where there's piles and piles
Buffalo
of
skulls.
dead buffalo that were killed not by the Native Americans, not by the Lakota, but by the U.S. military and the volunteer reserves because they wanted to starve them out.
Yeah.
Insane.
It is-
They blamed the
it's crazy.
victim for what they did because it's so atrocious that they killed so many of these animals. They practically wiped them out.
Yeah.
Absolutely
And I think
nuts.
that ties into it.
It's all of that white man's burden.
Which is dominance.
Yes, by any means necessary.
Yeah, and the end justify the means.
Mm-hmm.
It's domination over nature, domination over people and their own family.
Mm-hmm. It's the mentality. It's the psychology. That's why I loved that interview. They really talked about that because it really comes through. And there are a lot of theories, many, many interesting theories online. Mm-hmm. And many of them, I think, can fall under this umbrella of white man's burden, whether it's anti-Semitism, racism, misogyny, child abuse, incest, which is referenced very clearly, I think, in the scene before Jack's interview when he's reading somehow a Playgirl magazine that's in the lobby.
Right, which is strange.
The cover story in the Playgirl magazine is incest, why parents sleep with their children.
Yeah, I always thought that was sort of weird.
Well, I never really noticed it. I noticed this by searching online, so I'll have a link to that as well.
I didn't notice the sub, but I noticed it was Playgirl.
Yeah, exactly.
That to me was kind of
I thought that was weird.
But having watched Lovecraft Country, Arrest, many of those other shows, and then watching this, it's like all of a sudden was like, whoa, how did I miss all this stuff?
I think maybe that's why in episode 1, we looked at Lovecraft Country, and another really great show that deals with race and historical colonization and slavery called Arrest.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that in the Kubrick version, as opposed to the Stephen King version, the Stephen King version has Halloran, this black man who also has a shining. He's basically a magical Negro in many ways, and he saves the day. But in Kubrick's, he doesn't. And I think that's more realistic, because in many ways, we African Americans are placed in a position where we're almost expected to come save the day, right? And in reality, what happens is we don't.
Because you get killed.
Because we get killed.
Or
exactly.
sidelined
or whatever it is. So I thought it was way ahead of its time. Like he was actually stating something. And I think he was...
Yeah, because there's the dominant people and then the victims.
Right.
There's no room for in between.
Right. Whereas the others were dealing with the people who, like, Lovecraft Country. It's really the people who've been discriminated against. We're seeing it from their perspective. With The Shining, it's getting into that psychology of what is it that makes people so crazy to want to dominate in many ways.
Yeah, and you clearly see that the main focus of the whole movie is Jack and his descent into, I don't know, madness or evil or succumbing to his shadow self, however you want to.
Or trying to repress his shadow self.
And then it just all comes out with the hotel.
And it just comes out and takes over.
Yeah, well, maybe that's why the hotel affects him so much, is because he is suppressing all of that. And it just all comes out.
Well, what's interesting is that, like shaman and stuff will talk about the idea that when people are out of sync, that what we call possession is what happens. So there's that shamanic side that's often not talked about or very often.
Yeah,
and that kind of works in with Native American as well too.
Yeah, he's filled with anger, so he's totally out of balance.
Yeah.
And then it's just very easy for a hotel that has all of that pent up history, psychology, supernatural vibrations, whatever explanation you want. It's easy to be influenced because he was already ready to pop. And I'm sure next time we watch it, we'll have another interpretation.
Yeah, there's a lot of theories who actually try to dismiss the Native American aspect of it because the hotel was built
They acknowledge
later.
that they say that at the beginning, but I think you cannot escape it. And proof for me is in that interview with Diane Johnson.
Right,
where she clearly says they wanted a basis for this hotel.
Right.
And that's why they added that scene, which is not in the book.
Right.
Where they say, oh, yes, it was built from 1907 to 1909. And it was built on, Indian burial ground.
Yeah, and a lot of people said that it was just too late. But I think people mistake the Indian Wars for, like, Andrew Jackson's Indian Wars with the Creole and Seminole.
Exactly.
But we've had Indian Wars going all the way into the 1900s.
I mean, the conflict didn't end. Very close to the period of time when the hotel was built, you had the Colorado War. And many massacres there, but the big one was the Sand Creek Massacre. There was the Wounded Knee Massacre. And there's some really awful people that I think fall under this idea of psychology. Like during the Sand Creek Massacre, it was led by Colonel John Chivington. And he massacred 500 Native Americans, 2/3 of whom were women and children.
Right.
And he was actually publicly condemned, and there was a military and congressional hearing to establish his culpability. Like, he mutilated them.
You're that bad that even back then they tried you.
That's exactly
horrible.
right. That's
wow.
how bad that was. And I'm sure people have heard of the Wounded Knee Massacre. There were 300 Lakota people who were killed, 200 of which were women and children.
Yeah.
And it was almost the opposite with Wounded Knee. For killing 300 people, and I'm not sure how many were injured, they awarded 20 medals of honor, the highest commendation.
Yeah.
For this
There's
one-sided.
horrible pictures from that massacre of people being put in, like dead bodies just being like just shoved into.
It's horrible. And
graves.
again, this is all in that time period. And if we want to go even closer to the hotel time period, we have Theodore Roosevelt, who has some great quotes. He's very well known, too, for wanting to take Indian land, including building all the parks. You know, all those national parks was Native American land.
Yeah.
He was fine with taking that, and he gave much to settlers. And he has this quote, maybe I'll have you read that.
Yeah, this is from an 1886 speech, by the way. He says, "I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are the dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of every 10 are."
And that's the president at the time.
Yeah.
He ordered them to cut their hair. They made any ceremony. They only allowed Native Americans to have very limited education.
Right.
And he often said that he thought their purpose, just like white man's burden, was to civilize the Indian.
Yeah.
And that meant cutting any part of their culture away.
Yeah, it took up until the late 70s before they actually were allowed to legally practice their religion.
And there was another scene I found very interesting, and I don't know if I'm stretching it
Tell
there.
me.
Jack was in the bar with Lloyd.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to play that clip now.
Okay.
Because I just happen to have 2 20s and 2 10s right here in my wallet.
What I find interesting about that is Andrew Jackson is on the $20 bill.
Yeah, the Indian killer.
That's right. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act and was very active. He was an army general. He led many brutal campaigns against many different Native American tribes. And to this day, many Native Americans will not use the $20 bill.
No, they won't.
So I don't know if that was me stretching it, but
No,
there's
because-
a very strong link between Andrew Jackson and slaughtering of Native Americans.
Right, which again is domination because he had like a passionate hate for them.
He really did. If you think of the movie, there's not that much dialogue.
No, there isn't.
And so the words that they choose, I think, are the best indication of what their intention was.
Right.
And I think it cannot be understated the importance of the Native American slaughter.
Right.
And I think that is the only explanation for the river of blood
Yeah.
that comes pouring out of the elevator.
Yeah, because there's no way that it could have just been like 2 people that produced that, or 3 or
Yeah,
5, even 10 or
Whatever deaths,
yeah.
it did not equal that amount of blood gushing out.
Right.
You know, it was almost like a red Colorado River.
Yeah, if you take it at face value, that's the problem. That the river of blood is weird. But when you tie it back to the Native American burial
Right.
ground, then it makes sense.
And it's really tied to Danny. That was the first image he saw.
Right.
And in The Shining, he's connected to Halloran. He's connected to the hotel, which is why he has all these visions. If you take the Jungian interpretation, they're more connected to this collective memory.
What's interesting is that the collective unconscious that Jung talked about is that once you tap into it, it's just not it's everybody's consciousness.
Yeah, that's true.
So
that's
it's
true.
like
Everyone
he's tapping
shares this.
into the collective unconscious that sat in that hotel.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
And it's also that, you know, I guess not to sound new agey, but that spirit that resides there.
Yeah, well, if we take that psychological point of view, it's tapping into your ancestry
Yes.
of these things that most people are not conscious of anymore.
And what the thing is, too, is that there's 2 things. There could be the residue, but it's also the psychological behavior you learn from your parents.
See,
that
that's
they
why
learn from their parents, and so on.
I think it's both. You have that supernatural element. You have the shining, which connects them. They can speak to each other. They can see things. And just like Halloran explains, from the past, from the future, you can see everything.
Right.
And then you also have, I think, what drives it, and that's the psychology.
Right.
So that's
totally agree.
what I got.
I totally agree.
All right, so we're in
Right.
sync.
Yeah.
So now, Miguel, do you have any interesting side theories from the movie?
I wouldn't say side theories. I think it's overall metaphor for America.
Ooh.
I think that the house is supposed to represent the country, and the country is built on, well, stolen land too, all the things that were done to take it, and that those who lead are being driven insane by it. So
Actually, that is the ones that try to maintain the system are driven mad.
yeah, they're driven mad. That's why you're a caretaker. You're literally keeping alive the husk that you were born into, this of this
Right.
legal framework, this sort of twisted matrix.
Yeah, interesting.
That's how I see it.
Right. Well, they are stuck in time, as I think the photograph shows.
Right.
Because they will not move forward and they want to impose their will on everyone.
Right.
So the last bastion they have is this hotel.
Yeah. I kind of just see it as that. And I'm very much about the intergenerational thing
Okay.
and whatnot. But so what are your theories?
Well, I had two things that stood out for me. One is maybe a little bit more obvious, but again, I didn't really get it the first time around. And both have to do with connections to Greek mythology.
Okay.
And the first one with the maze is, of course, the myth of Theseus and the labyrinth and escaping the Minotaur.
Yeah, well, I can see that.
And the Minotaur is Jack, who is half man, half beast. He's already taken over by the hotel, whether, I don't know how you want to describe it, he's possessed, he's no longer himself.
Right.
And also in the myth, they feed children to the Minotaur,
Right.
which is poor Danny. And Danny had to use his wits in order to escape the Minotaur.
Interesting.
He didn't have the string, but he had that bright idea to step backwards into his footsteps so that he could escape from the labyrinth.
So what's your other theory?
The other, I thought, I laughed to myself when I saw this because I've read online, and there's that film too, Room 237,
Yeah.
that has many, many different fantastic theories on the meanings of The Shining. But one is that Kubrick was somehow admitting to having faked the moon landing.
Right.
And so he was, I don't know, I don't know if it was an apology or a mea culpa, or I'm not sure what. Fascinating, I think. And one of the main things they point to is Danny wearing the Apollo sweater. And when he stood up, to me, it was just so obvious. It says Apollo, and there's an arrow pointing straight to Danny's head.
The rocket, right?
The rocket, but it's an arrow.
Right, it is.
And Apollo in Greek mythology, one of his great gifts was of prophecy.
Right.
And Danny has the shining, and he can see the future. He sees it through the whole movie. And I'm
Right.
like, wow, how did I not notice that before? And as I mentioned, every time we watch this, we get something else.
Yeah, and actually you just made me think of something.
What?
You brought up 2, 3, 7. If you add them all together, you get the number 12,
Okay.
which is 12 disciples and so on. If you look at them separately, you have 2, which is Adam and Eve. You could say Jack and Wendy, right? 3, the Trinity. And then 7 is the number of completeness and perfection, both in physical and spiritual. And 7 is the foundation of God's Word.
Interesting.
The fantastically terrible character or creature this week is Robert Shaw's portrayal of Quint in 1975's mega hit, Jaws. So, 1,100 men went into the water, 316 men came out. The sharks took the rest. June the 29th, 1945. Anyway, we delivered the bomb.
Hats off to the man that had his manliness eaten in the most manly way possible by a 6,000-pound man-eater.
Youch! 7Robots, Fantastically Terrible podcast is by Miguel Guerra and Susie Diaz. The theme song is by Susie. For more information on the episode, including the links to everything we referenced, please visit our website at www.7robots.com/podcast.
The best way to support the show is to subscribe on iTunes. If you leave a comment, we'll thank you live on the show. You can also read our free comics on Webtoon, listed under 7Robots. We have a horror anthology called
Ghost Metal.
and a children's slapstick comedy called
Wolf Boy and the Magical Warriors. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.